I have a great deal of interest in history. I don't think that everyday Americans can even begin to understand our contemporary issues without putting them in a historical context.
A lot of people have this notion that Indians live in teepees, and there were feathers, and all of them were buffalo robes. Everything that seemed to portray Indians, that's not true of our people.
There's no such things as dancing with wolves in the Southeast or dancing with Dobermans or whatever else. The metaphor dancing with alligators doesn't work in the Southeast.
Dances with Wolves is only a recreation of Last of the Mohicans. The same savage and noble savage are present there. To a large extent the concept of the savage is used to justify the taking of the land.
From the Plains Indian Wars, you get the spectacle of Indians, and that was what became part of American consciousness about Indians. The experiences of the five tribes in the Southeast were not part of that history at all.
A lot of history about tribes has been written by soldiers or by ministers or people external to the communities, and so you don't get the other side.
We must begin to develop our own material, even our own movies, our own videos, whatever is necessary to educate our people.
We are the Choctaw, the Muskogee Creek, the Seminole, the Chickasaw, and the Cherokee. We are the children of the Mound Builders and heirs to a civilization that followed drifting river trade routes from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to Canada. The town of Tahlequah in northeastern Oklahoma has only a recent place in our history, born from the Cherokee Trail of Tears, but it is a symbol of our survival. Today it is the capital of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, a fitting place for representatives of our tribes to come together to discuss our histories and our future.
I'd like to talk about contemporary issues because I don't want to have people think we're frozen in time 200 years ago. And I don't like that image. People can deal with us if we're in museums, but they can't deal with us today.
Wilma Mankiller is the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation.
It's always been my opinion that the true history of American Indians have never been told. One reason I believe is it's dynamic, it changes. Our people have always been adaptive to change, and through this process it's very difficult to capture the true history of our people.
Ken York lives on Choctaw tribal land in Philadelphia, Mississippi. He teaches the Choctaw language at Mississippi State University.
I think histories, if they are to be representative, have to develop is that this record of people who didn't go away, that we're still there and living according to values and traditions that have been there forever.
Alan Cook is a Muskogee Creek historian from Holdenville, Oklahoma.
I think that if you wed a living historical account to a living culture, then you're producing a narrative that makes sense to Indian people.
Gary Whitedeer is a Choctaw artist and historian from Ada, Oklahoma.
In a sense, we're all consumers of history, and we go to the history store and we buy
race of supermen, white men who built the mounds before they founded the great civilizations of Mexico. Scientists finally decided that the mounds had been engineered by Native Americans, but that the Mississippian culture had collapsed and disappeared in the 1500s. But we have always known that these were our relations. Our oral histories tie us to the mound builders and beyond.
The migration to where we are now perhaps took thousands of years, I'm not sure, but it took a long time for our people to get here. Every time they would make a stop, they would put the sacred pole in the ground. But the next day, as an example, this pole would lean towards the direction that the people are supposed to go. The pole would give them direction, and the people would march again. And people brought everything with them, including the bones of the ancestors. And the feeling, the understanding that I get from that is that they would never return to their place of origin as far as the migration is concerned. When they reached what we now know as Mississippi River, they planted a pole in the ground. It's our understanding that a storm came, biblical proportions, and yet the next day this pole stood straight up. And since that time, we've always been where we are today, our ancestral homeland in Mississippi. Tabitit abachikiyahe. Tabitit abachikiyahe. Our people, when they built the mounds, they put this sacred pole down. And the Spirit gave them this song, and as long as they sing the song, the sacred pole would always stand straight towards the heaven. The
Native Americans will continue on TBS.
TBS presents the Environmental Media Awards. Join Maya Angelou, Mikhail Gorbachev, and your favorite celebrities for an extraordinary evening in Hollywood, celebrating the entertainment industry's concern for our planet.
There's so many things you can do.
I'm concerned about it all.
I think we can do better.
The Environmental Media Awards, televised for the first time ever. Sunday night, 11 Eastern.
Exclusively on TBS.
Now back to the Native Americans on TBS. From the beginning, they could not see what was here, and did not understand that our sense of place did not end at our porch steps. They brought their God, and
burned alive. All this did my own eyes witness. The cries of so much spilled blood reached all the way to heaven.
The people who are descendants of the group that lived around what is now Mobile say that they were treated very harshly by the Spaniards almost immediately. They were very demanding. They wanted not only food and shelter and clothing, but also the women. And of course, this did not go very well with the leadership at the time. And you have to understand, one of the leaders in one of the villages was also a woman leader. One of the chiefs that was mentioned in the chronicles and was highly respected was Tuscaloosa, black warrior. He somehow knew that DeSoto was here not in cause of friendship and peace. He would send runners to other villages that they were going to visit, and they prepared an attack, a surprise attack on Hernando DeSoto's expedition. The Choctaws did some damage. They injured a lot of Spaniards. Of course, there were a lot of Choctaws that died. Afterwards, the Chickasaws took care of Hernando DeSoto.
War stories often hide the more ruthless but less documented threats to our survival. The seduction of trade and the intermarriage of Indian women and white colonists turned our world upside down long before settlers stole our land.
The women, especially after about 1760, were squaws. They were denied the position and the power and the autonomy that they held within their own nations by these incoming whites who simply did not understand a balance between male and female.
There were many women who struggled to retain their traditional power, even after they moved into the white world. But their lives have become a mix of myth and tragedy. For generations, American schoolchildren have read the romanticized tale of Pocahontas, daughter of a powerful chief of the Powhatan Confederacy, who supposedly threw herself in front of the execution of English colonist John Smith, and pleaded with her father to spare his life. John Smith wrote and rewrote his story many times, but no native account was ever reported. Almost no attention is paid to the role of Pocahontas as a diplomat, who married the Virginia tobacco planter John Rolfe. They traveled to England with a message of peace and cooperation on behalf of her father. She dressed like an English aristocrat and was embraced by the royal courts of Europe, but she was not seduced by the wealth or glamour. She had every intention of returning to the rolling hills of the Potomac with her husband and infant son. But Pocahontas died of smallpox on the day she set sail for home. She was only 22. No one life is crisscrossed with the conflicting experiences of being an Indian woman in the colonial era, like that of the Cherokee legend, Nanyeha, who we know as Nancy Ward.
In the Cherokees' battle against the Creeks at Talowa in 1755, her husband was slain during that battle, and Ward picked up his gun and fought in his place and apparently spurred the Cherokees on to victory.
Years later, she married a white settler, and when the Revolutionary War broke out, she played an important role as peacekeeper between the colonists, the British, and the Cherokee.
During a bitter cold winter, 1780, 1781, Ward fed and clothed General Washington's troops who had gotten lost over yonder in the forest. She had provided an awful lot of corn and other food to the settlers over the years, and was repaid for her kindnesses by having her home and her town burned to the ground.
Like many Cherokee of her generation, Nancy Ward was trapped between two cultures and often chose European ways. She built a large corn and cotton plantation and was among the first of many successful Cherokee planters to own African slaves.
Ever since our contact with DeSoto, I think there's been a a battle, a struggle within the Cherokee Nation, the Cherokee people, over whether we should totally assimilate and whether that was the best route for our people, or whether we should partially assimilate, or whether we should retain our culture and sense of who we are.
Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, a handful of families in each tribe intermarried and traded comfortably with Europeans. They abandoned tradition and were more comfortable speaking English than their native languages. They owned plantations and slaves and sent their children to school in Paris, London, or Charleston. In the upside-down history of the times, they emerged as leaders of our tribes because they could speak English and were comfortable in the halls of Congress. But in 1812, with tribal lands overrun by settlers, a movement for the defense of land and culture caught fire among the thousands of Muskogee Creek who had continued to live traditional lives. Led by Red Eagle and Manawi, the movement came to be known as the Red Sticks because of the crimson paint on their war clubs. The Red Sticks banned the use of guns for hunting because the commercial market in deer hides had destroyed the native hunting grounds. They also opposed slavery and sheltered runaway slaves from plantations throughout the South. They waged war on frontier settlements. In the spring of 1814, General Andrew Jackson led an army against them at Horseshoe Bend on the Tallapoosa River in Alabama. Using clubs and bows and arrows against Jackson's well-armed troops, they were wiped out. To count the dead Creeks, Jackson's soldiers cut off their noses, collecting a pile of 557. The Red Stick movement had been crushed. The Muskogee Creek Nation was forced to open the last of its ancestral lands to white settlement. Over and over during the decades after the Revolution, our people moved west, away from their oldest towns in search of peace, even though the leaders of the new United States repeatedly assured us that our homes were safe and that we had a sovereign claim to the land of our ancestors. Both Congress and the Supreme Court described the tribes of the Southeast as distinct, independent political communities.
It may be regarded as certain that not a foot of land will ever be taken from the Indians without their consent. The sacredness of their rights is felt by all thinking persons in America. Thomas Jefferson.
The Indians, wrote Secretary of War Henry Knox, being the prior occupants, possess the right of soil. It cannot be taken from them unless by their free consent or by right of conquest in case of a just war. But along the western edges of American settlement, a very different reality was in the making.
As the Revolutionary War progressed, the Continental Army had no money. They were absolutely flat broke. They had no way to pay their soldiers. So they promised recruits in the Continental Army portions of land.
Neither the new settlers nor the newly formed states cared for the lofty words of the Founding Fathers. They became a battering ram in our forests and inflamed the divisions between our people. Into this world of turmoil, a great leader emerged, a fiery red star, Tecumseh, a Shawnee warrior born in the Ohio Valley, but comfortable in the longhouses of the Great Lakes, Cherokee councils in Tennessee, or the Muskogee camps of the Red Sticks. Tecumseh and his brother, known as the Prophet, traveled throughout our nations at the beginning of the 19th century, arguing that the great forests and river valleys were the common estate of all Native Americans, not any single tribe.
The only way to stop this evil is for all red men to unite in claiming a common and equal right in the land, as it was at first and should be now, for it was never divided, but belongs to all. No tribe has the right to sell, even to each other, much less to strangers, who demand all and will take no less. Sell a country. Why not sell the air, the clouds, the great sea, as well as the earth? Tecumseh.
The last hope of a unified Indian nation collapsed when Tecumseh died in battle, fighting the United States in the War of 1812. Each of our tribes was left to face an expanding America alone.
One of my very favorite stories in Cherokee history is the time in 1811, 1812, around that time, when a prophet supposedly came to the Cherokees and told the Cherokees that if they didn't give up white ways and go back to the old Cherokee ways, that they would die. And and of course no one died, and so that the people began to think that the prophet was, not truthful, and he lost.
The Native Americans will continue on TBS. Now back to the Native Americans on TBS.
This house was probably a very, very sad place to be on the morning of May 24th of 1838. On that day, there was a knock at the front door, and as the people who lived in this home opened the door, they saw U.S. soldiers standing outside the front door with guns pointed at them, saying, "Out. You, walk to a stockade," which had been built just over the hill here. And so with no time to take any of their possessions, any of their blankets, any food, any of their personal mementos with them, they were marched out with whatever they happened to have on at that moment and walked several miles to a stockade, something you would put pigs in, cows in.
Jess Bushyhead's great-great-great-grandfather was one of those rousted that day.
The U.S. Army commander gave specific orders that if the troops were to arrive at a home like this and the children were home but the parents were out in the fields, to take the children, kidnap the children, and that way they would force the parents to come in.
The idea of forcing us from our homelands and removing us west of the Mississippi River was not a new idea. It had been simmering since before the Revolution. But it was our land. And we were, they told us, the civilized tribes.
The principal chief of the Cherokee Nation in the early 1830s and later was a man named John Ross. He was 1/8 Cherokee. He had blue eyes. He was obviously very fluent in English. He owned a large plantation just south of Chattanooga.
John Ross very firmly believed in the American judicial system. He looked at the founding documents and believed that the U.S. actually would, pay attention to ideas about justice. But Georgia also strongly opposed having the Cherokee Nation a sovereign nation within the boundaries of what became the state of Georgia, which is very interesting because these states grew up around the Cherokee Nation and the other southeastern tribes, and then they bitterly resented having a separate sovereign entity within the states.
The southern states hated the fact that Indian nations had become a refuge for runaway slaves. But at the root of their hostility was a lust for land.
The place where we're standing is the hilltop overlooking Rattlesnake Springs. This is where in the summer of 1838 the United States Army and the Georgia troops involved in the roundup collected what at one point amounted to almost 13,000 Cherokee. They were living out here without any shelter, without any regular supplies of food. There were horses, cows, dogs, chickens. It was just a big mess. It was a concentration camp.
In and out of court for 5 years, John Ross and our lawyers were convinced that our sovereignty would be upheld and a way would be found to stall the removal policy.
part of our tribal people, I think, sort of felt very strongly that we should stay in the Southeast and fight to the death for the right to remain in the Southeast. And part of our people felt that we should participate in removal and accept a removal policy and move on to Indian Territory.
The Cherokee leadership in Washington was sending letters and messages back. Don't worry, we're going to be able to stop this. We have friends in Congress, we have friends in the U.S. Senate. We're going to be able to overturn this. We'll be able to stop it and prevent the soldiers from doing it. And then as dawn broke on May 24th of 1838, they found out the reality was very, very, very different.
The Supreme Court finally ruled that we could not be forced from our lands. But President Andrew Jackson simply turned his back on the court. He had built his reputation as an Indian fighter and an advocate of forced removal. He did not hesitate.
This is Blythe's Ferry. In 1838, this is the way the Cherokees got across the Tennessee River. My great-great-great-grandfather was one of the conductors. There were 13 conductors, each one responsible for keeping alive 1,000 Cherokees. In 1838, it was a wooden boat, steam-powered, most probably. It was a little smaller then, and they were able to cross in small groups, family by family, and person by person, wagon by wagon, horse by horse, sometimes almost sinking the ferry with the weight of the oxes and the horses. But their spirits were also sinking too, because as they're crossing the river, they're realizing that that is the Cherokee Nation, and they're leaving it for the last time. They'll never see the homeland that they were born in again. They'll never see the land where their fathers were buried. And all they have to look forward ahead of them is an 800-mile trek over land to the Indian Territory. This trip became known as the Trail of Tears. And so this ferry is the actual beginning of the Trail of Tears.
By the time the last contingent of Cherokees arrived in Indian Territory in 1839, April of 1839, fully 1/4 of our entire tribe had died either while being held on the stockades or during the removal itself. And the net effect is that we ended up in Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma, with many people dead, with the tribes bitterly divided politically over the issue of removal, of all of our economic system, our social system, our cultural system, everything we'd ever known had been left behind. And so our people were devastated. What has always amazed me, however, is how our people dealt with that. Rather than sitting around and wringing our hands over our situation, by the mid-1840s we began to rebuild again, and rebuild our families, rebuild our community, and rebuild a tribe, and rebuild a nation here in Indian Territory.
The Native Americans will continue on TBS.
The Indian must be imbued with the exalting egotism of American civilization, so that he will say I instead of we, and this is mine instead of this is ours. J.D.C. Atkins, Commissioner of Indian Affairs.
What happened to us at the turn of the century and the loss of land, when our land was divided out in individual allotments, had a profound, irreversible effect on our people, more profound than the closing of schools or courthouses or anything. When we stopped viewing land ownership in common and viewing ourselves in relation to owning the land in common, it profoundly altered our sense of community and our social structure. And so that had a tremendous impact on our people, and we can never go back.
The central component of the traditional order, the ceremonial ground, was not protected from the allotment process. So that today you have probably at least 30 ceremonial grounds that are out there on, private land generally.
Alone and spread out on the land, without citizenship or the protection of old treaties, we had almost no chance of survival. In fact, the whole idea was to strip away our tribal identities and remold us into small family farmers.
I remember my grandfather saying one time that the Indians wanted to maintain the tribal domain, but to his perception, it was all lost anyway. It wouldn't have done any good. They were corrupted by a mentality that the white people finally, or the federal policies and the social pressures and so on, finally created in them that they took away this regard that these Muskogee people had for the group, and they were on the road to becoming individualists.
It must have been the case, even in our classic late Mississippian periods when we were all running around with copper ear spools, supposedly, and stuff, that there was probably only about 10%, a core group anyway, that you would call or want to call culture bearers, folks that really had the spirit of that mindset that I'm talking about. And the other 90%, I happen to believe, were in varying ways waiting for fast food industry to hit America.
Today, when our elders die, we lose precious links to our past which can never be regained. But we have a strong will to survive, and there are flickers of revival.
The landscape has been transformed, but it still lives in the memory of the people, and it still inhabits our minds and I think our hearts too. And it's so important to understand how place resonates in Native American cultures.
This is my grandfather's allotted land, and there's a lot of history here. I can go sit on the porch and look across the road there and see flowers that bloomed in my grandfather's yard. And so history is not something distant from me. It's a part of who I am and a part of my everyday life. Many of the great events in Cherokee history happen not far from here. And I can walk to the spring any day when I'm a little bit troubled by some major event or problem. I can walk to the spring where my grandfather walked to make Cherokee medicine, or where I walked to when I was a child to gather water for household use. And so there's a lot of history about this place. I'm very tied to this land and to this place. It's very much who I am.
All the songs and dances in Oklahoma that had been put to sleep in my general area, called Put to Sleep, for 30 or 35 years, started coming back. The Choctaw songs and the Chickasaw songs and so forth, for a long time they had gone away or gone underground because of religious persecution. So we started hearing these songs again and seeing these dances again as they started coming out.
Can hardly sleep at night.
dances too, you will notice there's a locking of arms and elbows, a holding of hands. Our people dance as a group together. That community of spirit, that communalism, that desire to be part of a whole, taking your identity and cues from your traditional community. That's very much in evidence in our songs and dances, and even in our designs.
There's been recent interest in revival of our stickball games. The settlers, when they first came, thought that the game was too brutal, and of course people died in those games, so the missionaries especially tried to get the Choctaws from playing the game.
This is an Indian form of baseball, this thing right here. So this is our form of baseball. You know, they say baseball is an American sport, like this is our form. There's a lot of other tribes that still play this game.
In the Southeast, all these tribes have this game. And Cherokee people and Chickasaw people and Creek and Seminole and Choctaw, we all have that in common.
Once you play it one time, you get hooked on it.
Yeah.
I mean, I love this game.
I am absolutely convinced that we've survived because we've managed to hang on to language, and we've managed to hang on to ceremonies that we've had since the beginning of time. What we need to do to affirm ourselves as Native people is to take some of the values of interdependence, caring for other people, even though it's hard to do that in a society that says just care about yourself, take care of yourself, build your own house, and don't worry about anybody else. Take the old value of interdependence, or the values of making sure that spirituality, in the truest sense of the word, is incorporated into every aspect of your life.
And I think it's that spirit that the only thing we really have to rely on that's been handed to us like a live and precious coal, that each generation has to make that decision. Do they want to blow on that coal and keep it alive, or do they want to throw it away? To me, and it's not just the Southeast, but all Indian culture, but maybe using that metaphor for the Southeast as a fire, our cultures, our languages, our histories. It's like a big ceremonial fire that was kicked and stomped and scattered. And then this 200, 300-year night followed that. But out in the darkness, we can see these coals glowing. And I think our role in our generation, whether it's in tribal government or wherever we find ourselves, and Chickasaw people, Cherokee people, Creek people, Seminole people, Choctaw people, is to be coal gatherers, to gather those coals back up together and assemble them again at one point and breathe on them again, that we might be able to spark a flame around which we might warm ourselves.
The Native Americans will continue on TBS.